Well, welcome. First, I want to introduce myself. I'm Rich Kirchherr. I'm the senior pastor, and I've been one of the pastors here for 33 years, 34 years actually, and this September marks the beginning of my 23rd year as the senior pastor. So for the next 15 or 20 minutes, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about congregational history in general, the first Congregational church, and then the architecture of this church, and again, how they are woven together. The quick thumbnail sketch of Congregationalism is this. The Congregational church is originally the church of the Pilgrims, and then a few years later, the Puritans. And if you remember from your high school history book, the Pilgrims arrived in 1621. The oldest Congregational churches, which are still in existence, were started in the late 1620s, early 1630s, and many of them are in Cape Cod and in Connecticut. The Congregational church, though, founded by the Pilgrims, came here seeking religious freedom. In particular, separating, some of them became separatists, from the Anglican church, which we think of as the Episcopal church here in the United States. One of the things that the Pilgrims and then the Puritans thought was a great problem for them is that the bishops had too much power. So they had this radical, and it was radical thought, that the people of God, those who were seated in the pews, could better discern God's vision for who they are than any individual person, the bishop in particular, could. So they began early on to practice democracy. And one of the things that they said is that each congregation would be its own bishop. And then they also said something rather radical, which is each congregation was on earth the highest authority that they knew. But they only could do that together. That is, they would discern via conversation and vote and discussion and vision who God, as best as they could determine it, was intending them to be. And so each congregation is fully autonomous. That is, we make all of our own decisions. We act as our own bishop. We decide on our budget, on how big our mission budget will be. We decide on who our pastors are. You have the authority to call us and, if need be, to dismiss your pastors as well. And so, even though we belong to a denomination, it is a non-hierarchical tradition. And part of that you're going to see in a few moments in the architecture itself. Well, one of the great gifts of Congregationalism to our nation, the two great gifts, really is they were the litmus test for democracy. If you think about it, 1620 is 150 years before the Declaration of Independence, about 160 years before the Constitution. And so for generation after generation, they fine-tuned, practiced, tested whether they could actually govern themselves. Many of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were members of Congregational churches because they were used to the rhythm and pattern of democracy and governing themselves. But also, if you're going to govern yourself and faithfully discern God's vision for who you are as a congregation, you will need to be thoughtful and critical thinkers. So the Congregational church starts lots of the great, well-known colleges and universities of today. None of them are still affiliated with the Congregational church, but Harvard in 1636 is started as actually a training ground for Congregational clergy. It was partly an economic decision. It was cheaper to train them on the shores of what is New England than it was to bring them from England. And then Yale splits off from Harvard, but Dartmouth and Williams and Amherst, they believed in the education of women. Several of the Seven Sisters, Smith College, Wellesley, were started by the Congregationalists. And then as the nation moves westward, Oberlin in Ohio and Grinnell in Iowa, Carleton College in Minnesota, all started by the Congregational church, along with dozens more universities and colleges. Again, it was an understanding that not only should the clergy be educated, but also the lay people, so they could discern faithfully, but imperfectly, that people can, God's vision for who they will be. So that sort of in a nutshell is Congregationalism. And we're a Congregational church and was gathered, or that's what you say about a church, Congregational church. It's not founded, it's gathered. The people of God are gathered. And it was gathered in 1887. Now it's situated in Western Springs, and the village of Western Springs was founded just a year earlier as a Quaker community. But for about 15 years before our church starts in 1887, the pastor of the Lionsville congregation, which is out at the corner of Route 66 and Wolf Road, he would ride his horse down what was then East Plank Road to the gathering of houses here and have a Bible study on Sunday afternoons. And then it was finally, as I said, in 1887 that they are called as a Congregational church, and they also called their first pastor the Reverend Perry. Now, Reverend Perry was coming to us from Dowagiac, Michigan, and he writes this beautiful letter that we still have in our archives about what it means to start and call your first pastor. And he writes to our church and says, and he dates it of Christmas Eve of 1886, I am honored to be called as your pastor, but I do not expect a perfect congregation, and you should not expect a perfect pastor. But despite our faults and foibles, we will bear one another's burdens in the name of Christ and move forward into the future. And it's wonderful, isn't it? Not a perfect church, not a perfect pastors, but despite our faults and our stumbles, we bear one another's burdens in Christ's name. That is still the spirit of the Congregational Church of Western Springs today. Well, we first meet in the Grand Avenue Community Center, which is about 2 blocks east of here. It was the Grand Avenue School at the time. That's our first place of worship. And then in 1894, we built our first building, our first church, which was just to the north of where the Grand Avenue Community Center is. The church doesn't exist anymore. We sold it to another church in town when we moved out of it, when we built this sanctuary. But Western Springs begins to grow, and it was primarily a village church at the time. And the church begins to grow, and by the early 1920s, and the economy was fairly robust at the time, they decided, let's begin to plan to build a new church. And so they buy what they thought was this huge amount of land, 14 pieces of property on which this church sits. But again, because it was a village and local church, and people oftentimes walked to church then, they didn't have the parking lot that we have today. That land was purchased in the early 1950s, and a home was there, and they tore it down and put a parking lot there. But today we have a church of 12 to 1,400 members and a parking lot for 27 cars. So what they thought was a huge amount of land turned out to be now what we would think of as the minimum needed. And they hire this architect, George Grant Elmsley. Now Elmsley was probably the last sort of disciple of the Prairie School. He is today considered maybe the second or third finest Prairie School architect in our nation's history, but the greatest, of course, being Frank Lloyd Wright. And if you're familiar with the Prairie School, it is, of course, this horizontal, this long, low sense that it is a part of the landscape. The building is a part of the landscape. It doesn't stand opposed to the land, but blends in with it. So you have these long, they're called cantilevered eaves in Prairie School homes. And George Grant Elmsley thought that the Prairie School was the perfect architecture. He had never really designed a church before, and this is well past the period of the height of the Prairie School. And so in the late 1920s, he designs what he knew. He had been born in Scotland, and yes, our church looks quite a bit like an English or a Scottish country church as you arrive. The yellow limestone, the slate roof. But in the interior, when you're in here, and I'll show you some of the details in a moment, it might be a little shaky, so bear with me as I turn the camera around. But he put in the ceiling level Gothic arches, because this church, like every self-respecting church in the 1920s, wanted a Gothic church. He hated Gothic churches because he thought they were, as he writes to us, bloodless simulacrums of what were once truly great architecture. So he designs them a Gothic church that he knew they couldn't afford, they reject it, and he designs the current sanctuary that we have. But he designs it then, the outside in English or Scottish country church, and up at the roof line he has the Gothic arches. But where we sit as a congregation, he writes to us and says the prairie school with its horizontal feel is perfect for a congregational church. It's non-hierarchical. And he also wanted to emphasize not the God who was beyond us, the otherness of God, the God that you are to feel when you walk into a cathedral in Europe, for instance, and you look up and you are awestruck, which is theologically correct as well. But Elmsley wanted us to think of the immanence of God, the God in our midst. The Advent hymn, O come, Emmanuel. Emmanuel literally means God with us. It gives us the word immanence, the God who was in our midst. So Elmsley wanted us, when we serve one another communion and say the bread of life or the cup of God's love, to think of God's presence among us, with us. And so the architecture at the congregational level reflects that. And so to turn to the back of the church. And as you can see right now, right in the middle is that oak string course, right? It's the top of the door jambs. And as it wraps around, you can see that oak string course blends into the horizontal stonework of the windows. The windows, by the way, are Elmsley's originals. I know you can't really see them well now, but there's no religious symbolism to them. Elmsley thought that beauty reflects positively on God, that you don't need the specific symbols to do that. And then we come along and the string course continues and the stencil is right underneath it, and we come to the pulpit. It's the top of the string course is also the top of the pulpit. And then it continues all the way around the front. And imagine that there were no organ pipes there, but the altar screen, that beautiful organic design that has no specific religious meanings. Remember, beauty reflects positively upon the presence of God. The only thing that sits above this chair rail all the way around is the cross. And of course, it continues this way. And what emphasizes also the horizontal nature, and I hope you can see it more closely here, are the beautiful stencils that Elmsley designed. These are the originals to the sanctuary. And again, as you look and we pan through, you see that horizontal nature all the way around. And remember, Elmsley wanted us to think of the God in our midst when we are here. Well, the church is completed, and the first Sunday that they celebrate here was Easter Sunday of 1929. 6 months later, the stock market crashes, and America is thrust into its most catastrophic economic experience ever, the Great Depression. By 1934, this church had projected 5 years out. They thought they would have a budget maybe of around $40,000. They project a budget of about $8,000 for 1934. And at their annual meeting, they record some of the difficult decisions they had to make. Now remember, they made these decisions, and the spirit of those decisions, in my mind, continue to this day in the life of our church. They could not even make the full interest payments on the loan for the building of the church. Many of the members who had made capital pledges to help share in the cost of the building of the church were not able to fulfill them. It was a dark time for a nation. It was a difficult time for this congregation. But still, going into 1934, having a budget that was 1/5 of what they thought it would be, they increased 2 areas of their budget. And those 2 areas are still prominent ministries in the life of our church today. The first one was that they increased their support for the Christian education and formation of their children and their youth. And they believed that they needed to tell the story of God's love, mercy, and justice to the next generation so that they could tell that story of love, justice, and mercy to the one that followed them. To this day, we continue to give an abundance of support to our ministry with our children, with our young people and our young adults, knowing that they will be the ones telling the story of God's love to the next generation. And then the second thing our church did in 1934 at the start of the year was to increase their mission budget. They acknowledged that there were more people, more neighbors in need, neighbors that both they knew by name and neighbors whose names they might never know. But there were more people in need than ever. And how could they be a church and not support those who were in need? And so, in the darkest economic catastrophe in our nation's history, our church took a remarkable vision. Remember, they were their own bishop. They discerned who God was calling them to be. And he was calling them to support and increase their support for the formation of their children and their youth in their Christian faith, and to care for their neighbors. Again, both the ones they knew by name, the ones whose names they would never know. Friends, you're joining a congregation in which that spirit continues to this day. We continue to have a very robust mission budget, and as I said, to be very supportive of our ministry with our young people and our children. So, in just a couple of Sundays from now, you are going to join our congregation. And you're going to say these remarkable words: we take this church to be our church, promising so far as in us lies to share its work, sustain its worship, love its members, and seek its unity, purity, and increase. It's a covenant. And a covenant is a phrase out of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, that is an agreement made between people and before God. And together, just as Reverend Perry wrote to our congregation when he started as the first pastor, together we will go forth into our future, not perfectly, but bearing one another's burdens in the name of Christ. Blessings